to our fourth episode in CHBA's webinar series, Working with Modular. I'm Frank Lohman, CHBA's Director of Building Science. And for today's webinar, I'm joined by Kathleen Maynard, CHBA's Senior Director of Building Innovation, and Sim Baines, Vice President, Manufacturing at CSA Housing. Kathleen and I are part of CHBA's technical team that supports the CHBA Modular Construction Council, and CSA Housing is a member of that council. Before I introduce all of us in a bit more detail, I have some housekeeping items. Number one, you'll have figured out that we've muted all participants so that there are no distractions. We will, however, try to make the webinar a bit interactive. First, you can ask questions throughout the webinar by writing them in the question and answer panel that you should see as one of the icons on your bar. And maybe let us know if you ask a question who you would like to direct that question to, so it's easier for us to moderate the Q&A session at the end. We may answer some of your questions live or directly in the Q&A panel for everyone visible during the webinar, or in writing after the webinar has ended. Secondly, as to the interactive part, we will have a few polls ready for you. Whenever we launch a poll question, you will see a response function pop up. Actually, let's try that right now, Kathleen, if you can bring up the first poll. It's asking for the primary region where you and your business or organization operate. And so you see here, it's not every province. We have combined a few of them. That's because we're limited to 10 choices in these polls, but hopefully you can identify what your primary regions are. And Kathleen, when you see that we have results, then you can maybe bring up the results so that we see our national representation. There you see, oh, today BC is a clear winner. That's great. So we have about 50% from BC, the prairies following, and Quebec with close to 20%, Ontario, Quebec, sorry, and the Atlantic provinces with 7%. And national organizations are 2%. And today, nobody from outside Canada or the territories. Great representation. Thanks, Kathleen. Also, what I'd like you to be aware of in terms of housekeeping is that the webinar is being recorded, and that the recording will be available on CHBA's website in case you can't stay to the end or you want to listen to a certain portion again. And we will also post the slide deck to this webinar on the CHBA website on the Modular Construction Council page. I'm pointing this out now because we will go through some slides fairly quickly, so you may want to review that on your own time later on. Lastly, even though you probably all experienced in Zoom or Teams or WebEx webinars, just to remind everyone, you can manage your own view of the webinar and make the PowerPoint bigger or smaller by sliding the dividing bars. And with that, I'd like to just say a few words about the webinar series itself and why we're giving it. The entire webinar series consists of 6 webinars that were delivered in 2022 or will be delivered in 2023. The QR code at the bottom right here leads to the recordings of the past webinars that I've been mentioning. And you can see the titles and the dates of each of the webinar on the right. The purpose of the series is to provide information on the modular construction sector in Canada. And for the entire series, we're hoping that code officials, municipal planners, housing providers, all find an interest in what we present, as well as builders who are currently building homes on site rather than off site, or builders who have started experimenting with modular construction. We also hope that federal government departments and other stakeholders engaged in the residential construction industry find the information useful and apply it in their work so that modular construction gets the credit it deserves. And for this episode on code compliance, we are, of course, hoping that we are joined by a lot of building officials and municipal planners. And to find that out, let's try another poll right now to find out who is represented in today's audience. So if you can choose the discipline that best describes your profession and or your function or role. Again, there's 10 choices. We couldn't get the broad spectrum of our audience all into those 10 choices, but we're hoping that you can find yourself and otherwise select other to tell us that we need to expand our selection. So, and if we have the results, Kathleen, maybe you can bring them up. Wow, okay, that's a clear winner here. Look at that, 60% code officials, that's what we were hoping for. And we have modular builders, we have site builders, municipal planners, also 2%. governments, architects and engineers, all about in the 5 to 10% region, products, manufacturers, suppliers, and others. So there's a fair deal of people we haven't captured in our 10 choices. Excellent. Thank you so much. At this point, I'd like to also acknowledge the support of the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation in the development of the webinar series, as well as the Altus Group for their work in the project. And for this webinar in particular, I'd also like to thank the Alliance of Canadian Building Officials Association, who helped us to promote this webinar to building officials. And apparently it worked, so thank you very much. Today's webinar is about code compliance for modular construction. In the first part, we're learning how building codes across the country deal with factory constructed buildings. Then we will learn which CSA standards are relevant and how they apply to the conformity assessment process. And lastly, we'll get to see how code compliance happens in the factory. And last but not least, I would like to finally introduce today's speakers. Those of you who joined us in December already know Simajit Bains. Sim is the Vice President Manufacturing at M Housing. She leads the operations of M Housing manufacturing facility in Lethbridge and oversees safety, quality, production, customer service, and design. Sim has over 20 years of experience in the industrial and construction sectors. And in 2018, Sim was given the Top 40 Under 40 Award by Lethbridge Chamber of Commerce. Congratulations, belated. Kathleen Maynard is CHBA's Senior Director of Building Innovation. She heads up CHBA's technical team responsible for CHBA's Modular Construction Council and Technical Research Committee. Kathleen is also chair of the CSA Technical Committee on Prefabricated Buildings, Modules and Panels, and is a member of CSA's Strategic Steering Committee on Construction and Civil Infrastructure. Kathleen was an environmental consultant and was CEO of the Canadian Manufactured Housing Institute prior to joining CHBA. And I am Frank Lohmann. I've been the Director of Building Science here at CHBA since May 2020 and have supported Kathleen on the Modular Construction Council and as a member of the technical team at CHBA. Before CHBA, I worked for 23 years at the National Research Council on the development of the National Construction Codes, advising committees on technical process and policy issues. And now I work on many of the same codes and standards committees, making sure builders and renovators' interests are represented properly in regulation, including the Canadian Electrical Code and some climate change related standards. So to start us off, I will refresh everyone's memory as to the difference between off-site and on-site construction when it comes to the code compliance process, in particular for inspections. Then I'll review the provisions in the 2020 National Building Code related to code compliance for factory constructed buildings. And following that, I will give you an overview of some provincial and territorial codes and regulations, including the most recent amendments to the Ontario Building Code. So we ended our previous webinar on the factory process with this slide, and I would like to bring it up here again at the beginning to point out key differences in the process schedule between off-site and on-site construction that will highlight a key difference for the conformity assessment of factory constructed buildings. You can see here that the initial permits and approvals happen at the same point in the schedule in both processes. Site installations such as foundations, service connections are also handled in the same process step, I should say, not necessarily same schedule. And inspections of the actual building is where the processes are different. I'm showing that here in red, where all the inspection processes are done at the site, and the in-factory inspections are in green. So the process step framed in green is the portion of the process that we're focusing on today. We're hoping that a better understanding of the factory certification process leads to time savings for both builders and building officials so that the entire residential construction sector can build more homes in less time for Canadians. But it's not just time savings for enforcement. In-factory construction also delivers housing with less site disruption and less neighborhood noise during construction. And as to other benefits, we've also dedicated an entire webinar to the environmental benefits of modular construction when it comes to GHG reductions, waste reduction, and resilience. So please make sure you check out other webinar recordings on that topic. So finally, the code. Here is Division A of the National Building Code. It states that the NBC applies to all buildings, whether site or factory built. Factory constructed is, however, not defined in the NBC. but the CSA A277 standard provides a definition of factory that describes the main intent as providing protection during the fabrication process, so fairly general. National codes are model codes, and the provisions only become requirements when they are adopted by the local authority having jurisdiction. This means that all buildings, including factory-built buildings, must comply with the locally applicable building codes and regulations in effect, and that they should be checked, verified, and inspected against the requirements in the location they are built in. And Division C of the National Building Code is the place where administrative provisions are found. And here we find that for compliance on the work completed away from the building site, an off-site review to determine compliance with this code is permitted. In other words, the NBC applies the same provisions to site-built and factory-constructed buildings and requires an off-site review for factory-constructed buildings or portions of the building. And although not specifically referenced in the NBC, this off-site review can be done through certifying the entire factory construction process to the CSA A277 certification standard, just like other certified products being installed in buildings. And Kathleen and Sim will talk in more detail about CSA A277. For now, let me just say that CSA A277 does not provide technical requirements. It is administrative. It details the procedure for certifying compliance of factory constructed buildings or components with the requirements of the locally applicable building code and regulations. It's a mouthful, but we'll say it many times over during this webinar. So if a factory constructed building in Canada bears the label of an accredited certification body, something like what you see at the bottom right, the certification body guarantees that the work completed in the factory meets the requirements of the code and regulation in effect at the installation site. That provides local inspectors then with the assurance that concealed components and all other factory-built parts of the home do not require reinspection on site. With that knowledge in mind, let's have a look across Canada how provincial territorial building codes reference CSA A277. As I said, CSA A277 is a procedural standard, and as such, it's not directly referenced in the National Building Code. Instead, it is discussed in a Division A appendix note that explains the role of this standard. The table on the slide shows which provincial and territorial codes or regulations require A277 certification, as in Alberta, Quebec, and the Yukon, and where A277 is recognized and accepted, either by provincial territorial regulation or codes or by municipal policy or regulation. I will now show examples of code provisions in the following slides where certification is required and also some where it's recognized regionally. So here you see a variation from Alberta to their Division C. The Alberta edition of the NBC has an exception in sentence 3 for relocatable industrial camp buildings built prior to April 2019. But other than that, they simply expanded sentence 1 from the NBC in Article 2275 with a sentence that requires certification to CSA A277 for offsite constructed buildings. And those of you from Alberta will know that relocatable buildings are addressed in Part 10 of the Alberta edition of the NBC. There's also a UL 2600 standard for relocatable buildings, but we won't get into that today. The Quebec Construction Code is organized slightly differently. As you can see here, the QCC defines prefabricated buildings rather than using factory constructed. And then it requires these buildings to be certified to CSA A277 before they can be sold, rented, exchanged, or acquired. The Quebec Construction Code even goes one step further and specifies what being certified actually means and links that to certification to CSA A277 being deemed to comply. In April 2022, the Ontario's Building Code Authority approved an amendment with an effective date of July 2022 that changed the application of CSA 277 referenced in the OBC. CHBA's Modular Construction Council had submitted a code change request asking for this. The effect of that change is that the OBC now recognizes CSA A277 certification for non-residential factory-built buildings in addition to residential buildings. So there's a deemed to comply provision for factory constructed residential buildings in Part 9, And the same logic is applied for all Part 3 factory constructed buildings, but that provision is located in Division C. In sentence 3.112.111, I missed one, of Division C, the OBC also exempts personnel inspecting factory constructed buildings during fabrication from its administrative requirements for building officials' qualifications, because the certification already includes qualification requirements. And in the same way, sentence 3.24.1.3 of Division C exempts personnel designing factory constructed buildings from the same qualification requirements in the OBC, because the qualification requirements are already part of the certification process. So this is one example that we would categorize as factory construction certification being recognized rather than being required. The Building Regulation Act of New Brunswick exempts inspection at substantial completion of structural framing for factory-built homes, but is otherwise silent on requiring certification. So with that, in summary, this is my last slide, I would encourage you to study the codes and regulations in your region to find out how factory certification is referenced in the applicable building regulations. And with that, I'll hand it over to Kathleen now to describe the relevant primary standards applicable to modular construction.
Thanks, Frank. As Frank said, I'm going to give you a brief rundown of standards and guides related to modular construction. So we have CSA A277, the Z240MH series, Z240.10.1, Z250, and Z252. So CSA A277 is an administrative standard. It doesn't contain any technical requirements. And similarly, Z250, it is administrative, and a new draft guide, which is currently out for public review. Both of these are administrative and informational. On the technical side, we have the Z240MH series and 10.1. So I'll discuss those briefly as well. So the CSA A277 standard is the primary standard for offsite construction compliance assurance. It was first published way back in 1972, so it's been around and in use for quite a while. It enables local building officials to assess the conformity of factory-built buildings, modules, and panels to building codes and standards mandated locally. The standard provides a framework for certification programs for factory constructed buildings, building modules, and fully or partially closed panels for panelized buildings. And as Frank was saying, it applies to both residential and non-residential buildings. And the requirements of the standard are consistent with the requirements for certification of manufacturers according to ISO 9001. So A277 is discussed in the appendix of the National Building Code for Division A, as Frank said. And it says that if a factory constructed building bears the label of the accredited certification agency indicating that compliance with the NBC has been certified using the A277 procedure, the accepting authority will have assurance that the concealed components do not require reinspection on site. And I know that's a bit repetitive from what Frank was saying, but just wanted to drive that one home. What's important to recognize is that the certification may be relied on whether or not the standard is directly referenced or not, the same as any other product certification with all the products that are in a home. So clause 4.1.1 of the A277 standard says that you must comply with the local codes and regulations in force. So in a province or chartered city that has enacted its own code, those local codes apply to the construction of a factory-built building. If there are no local codes or regulations in force, the standard stipulates that the building must be designed and constructed to comply with the NBC or the Z240MH standard where it's recognized, along with the other national codes as applicable. So this also applies to other codes like the Canadian Electrical Code, for example. The label, like the one in the center of this slide, is applied at the factory and shows that the home was produced in a certified factory in accordance with those local codes and as detailed on the specification sheets inside the house. So that brings us to the specification sheet. In whole buildings, this is typically found on or near the electrical panel, somewhere where it's unlikely to be removed. For modules and panels, the sheet must be provided to the building owner and retained with the building. So the spec sheet provides the information needed to determine if the building has been designed and constructed for the installation location. So to address the wind, snow, earthquake loads at the site, to provide adequate resistance to precipitation ingress, to comply with the energy efficiency requirements for the climate zone. It will list the outside design temperature used in heat loss calculations. It will give information on installed or supplied appliances, the complete electrical rating. That's also that the building official can check against what is required at the site. So in addition, if applicable, the spec sheet will indicate if the building or module has passed the deformation resistance test provided in Z 240.2.1 to confirm compliance with site-specific requirements. So I'll talk further about those Z 240 standards in a few minutes. Back to A277, it can be applied to building of all types, sizes, and occupancies. And while the standard was traditionally used to certify light wood frame, it can be used for buildings or modules and panels constructed of any building material, including used materials, provided they comply with the requirements locally. Factories should also be certified in accordance with other standards if they produce buildings that are made of other materials. For example, for aluminum, we have CSA A277. For precast concrete, we have CSA A277, and for steel, we have A660. So the products that can be certified in the factory depend on its capabilities and the scope of the factory's certification. For example, a plant might be certified for Part 9 single-family houses only, or it may be all Part 9 buildings, or Part 9 and Part 3. So what is certified also depends on the qualifications of the certification body to evaluate the design and construction and the certification body's accreditation. So A277 certification to A277 must be conducted by a certification body that is accredited by the Standards Council of Canada. So certification includes both the manufacturer factory's quality system and quality program, as well as the actual buildings, modules, or panels produced. The certification bodies oversee the in-plant quality process, including identifying qualified personnel and responsibilities, sign-offs, and record keeping, and they conduct annual audits and random inspections. Information on factory certifications can be found on the websites of the certification bodies, and those are companies like CSA's Testing and Certification Arm, Quality Auditing Institute, QAI, Intertech, for example. Information on their qualifications can be obtained from the Standards Council of Canada. The SCC website lists the accredited bodies for a given scope. So it helps to know when you get to their website, the International Classification of Standards Code for Building and Systems. We've put a link on this slide that goes directly to that page, so you can find it after you've downloaded our slides. And I just highlight that nice little image that Frank has put together to try and make it a little easier to understand how this all works. So you've got the SCC providing accreditation, the certification bodies providing certification, and the factories then producing and sending out those certified houses or buildings or modules or panels. So on to Z240MH. There's a couple of technical standards that do have additional technical requirements that are referenced or recognized for compliance. And one of these is Z240MH, manufactured homes. So in addition to local regulation, some jurisdictions reference or recognize this series for compliance. The application of Z240MH is limited to one-story single-family detached houses. So most of the requirements, the technical requirements in this standard mirror those of the National Building Code. But there are some differences, such as increased requirements to provide durability during transport, for example. The NBC references Z240.2.1, structural requirements for manufactured homes. And it provides a deformation resistance test. I mentioned that earlier. It applies to both site and factory built buildings, the deformation resistance test. So buildings and modules that pass this test may be installed on point load surface mount foundations, even if the soil is subject to moisture movement. The NBC also references Z240.10.1, site preparation, foundation, and installation of buildings. This standard contains requirements for surface mount foundations where buildings, not just houses, complies with the deformation resistance test I was talking about that was provided in Z240.2.1. And again, the Z240.10.1 applies to both site built and factory buildings. And all of these standards can be downloaded from the CSA website. A relatively new standard that was published in 2021 describes a process for delivery, and by delivery we mean project delivery, for modular buildings where modules are constructed in a factory. So this standard is helpful to inform project management for large multi-story buildings in particular. It specifies procedures such as design, quality control, approvals, logistics, transportation and storage, installation and finishing. The standard doesn't cover the procedure for in-factory certification because that's covered in A277, as I described earlier. Another new document from CSA is an information guide that is currently out for public review, CSA Z252. It provides information on best practices for inspecting and approving modular construction projects. So it contains information on plans preparation, applicable codes and standards, third-party inspection agencies' roles, installation inspection procedures. This one should be particularly helpful to building officials. The draft guide was just released for public review in December, and it's on now until February 18. You can download that from the CSA public review website, and we included the link here as well. So that's a description of some of the standards that apply to offsite construction. I'll pass it over to Sim for the fun part. She'll take you on a tour of how compliance is achieved in the factory.
Thank you, Kathleen. Hello, everybody. I'm glad to see that we have such a broad participation. What I would like to focus on is we've talked about the technical side of it and the codes. I want to take you inside a factory at M Housing and go through the code check, certification, and quality checks that are in place and how that really works in real life. So we did some drone footage. This factory is located in Lethbridge, Alberta. So something to really be mindful of when we talk about modular construction, we are building inside out versus outside in. And from a traditional construction perspective, the goal is really, to try to get the building weather tight because you're worried about moisture coming into the building. In a factory, we get to control the environment. It is temperature controlled. Our materials are stored inside. So we build more for an assembly line for efficiency, safety, and for quality. So you're going to see as we look at this footage, each of the bays that you see a unit in is a different workstation. And I'm going to talk about what happens at these workstations to look at the quality, specifically the checklists that are required and the testing that's required. And this is all part of that third-party certification and the quality assurance program that lets us become certified. And once we go through and talk about each of those inspection and test points and the checklist, it hopefully will give you a better idea of why factory construction is put through a very rigorous process and what testing has already been done before it arrives at site. A lot of what you're going to see here is that our production line, because it works on an assembly line, we get to also control the schedule, our manpower, and training of our employees. We do have to send in qualifications when we are getting our third-party certification. of our personnel. At the same time, we also have a dedicated quality department that's walking this assembly line. And at M Housing, we have 5 full-time inspectors, and that's their job, is to go and make sure, audit our process, that we are following our quality assurance program, that the checklists are being completed, and that the testing is also done. All of these steps have to be done before they're able to label the home. So hopefully this drone footage, for those who've never been in a modular factory, gives you an appreciation, an idea of what that setting is. So as we talk about further into this, what the different steps are, it'll make a little bit more sense. You also notice a QR code at the bottom of the slide. The previous webinar, for those who couldn't attend, goes step by step of the factory process. Really encourage you to go look at that if you've never been in a modular factory, because we go into quite a bit of detail of how the actual construction process works. Very large facility. This one in particular is one of the largest in Canada. It was purpose-built. It's 215,000 square feet of space, and roughly we have about 35 workstations. So at any given time, we have 35 homes that are in process. And again, the big advantage is it's temperature controlled, we're inside, and we don't have to worry about weather. So as my colleagues mentioned, in factory inspections, it has to be done by a third-party inspection agency, and that is a requirement to be able to label under CSA A277. These are, for ourselves, the Quality Auditing Institute, QAI is who we use. As Kathleen mentioned, there's also organizations like Intertech, the CSA group. As part of our quality assurance program, we have to submit a manual. And this manual has to describe what our organization is, the qualifications of our personnel, the checklist that we'll be using at each workstation, the testing that we'll be doing, and the documentation that's expected to be kept on file. Our program is inspected annually. Any changes that happen, we bring that in. And then on top of that, quarterly, we have random audits that come in. So we will be we will have our inspectors walking the line every single day, and then our third-party certification company comes in once a quarter to make sure we are following the program as we lay out in our quality assurance program. So to be certified, it's really, really important for all factories. It's a right to operate, and that label makes sure that we are always following our quality assurance program. So as I go through some further slides, we'll talk about what those checkpoints are and the testing is. But really, the label is to confirm, if you see that on the electrical panel with that specification, that this product does conform and it is built to code, because that's a requirement of CSA A277. However, if there's work to be done on site, for example, decks may need to be built, services need to be connected, those do need to be inspected by the local authority once it's done and finished on site. Anything that's done and completed in the home with that label on there lets you know that the checklist was followed, that we did follow a quality assurance program that was certified by a third-party company. So a big part of being certified is documentation. For ourselves, we keep all our records on file for a minimum of 5 years. And what we do is every modular unit that you had seen in that drone footage, it is identified by a unique serial number. This serial number is put on all documentation. When we start a module in the factory, we create a travel log. That travel log has the history of everything that's happened to that unit. At every single workstation, there's a checklist where the worker who does the work must sign off that they have done it. Then the foreman in the area has to sign off that it meets the quality standard. And our 5 inspectors that we employ, when they're walking the line, they also have to sign off that they have done random inspections. The serial number is also put on all testing documents, as well as on our shipping document when it leaves the factory with the transportation company. Our design documents also have our serial number attached to them. So when we are getting certified, we do have to submit a design package of the product that we want to certify. So this will be structural, electrical, mechanical, roof trusses, floor trusses, our plumbing schematics, our electrical schematics, heat loss, ventilation, floor plans, any cross sections that are required. So all of this is documentation that we keep in the factory for every single unit that we have. The way documentation is stored at factories varies. Ourselves at M Housing, we have a digital as well as we have original copies. Seems a little bit redundant and a lot of work. However, when you use only paper copies, if there's a fire, then you lose your history. And then digital, we're understanding with people on the cloud, you can have issues with hackers and things like that. So we have decided to go and do both. Like I said, this documentation has to be available for a minimum of 5 years. Any change orders, so that's something that we hear a lot about, is that, well, once you have a project and you're building it in the plant and a customer wants to do a change order, which is very typical, that also is kept in the documentation. And then we have to follow the process to make sure change management happens and that it was inspected to make sure that it was done properly. So starting with the factory checklists. So checklists are used in the factories to ensure our procedures and processes are being used and it's being checked. So it's one thing to do the work, it's another thing to make sure it's done correctly. So every single workstation, and these are just examples of the workstations that, that I'm showing here on the screen, will have the listed items that ensures that, one, that our people are building it correctly, two, that it's going to meet code and it's going to follow our quality assurance program. So as mentioned, at these stations, the employee doing the work signs off. We also have a section for observations if there's anything they would like us to note. Then the supervisor of the area, the foreman, signs off that the person doing the work is competent and qualified. And then we also have a spot for a quality inspector to sign off that we are following our quality assurance program, and they have also done inspections and checkpoints, and they will sign that off as well. In total, with all our workstations, we have over 100 points that are checked and double checked to make sure that the workstations are being performed in a manner that will meet our quality assurance program. So when you saw that drone footage, each of those units that you saw on the shop floor is a workstation. So at each point, that travel log sits on the unit, follows it down the assembly line, and as it moves along, the employee will keep going and filling out that checklist. And at the very end, that whole booklet should be complete with all the data and information for that unit. As well, because we are CSA certified, we also have to inspect all the materials that we are using, that it is acceptable to be used in the unit. So our receivers, our purchasers, our quality inspectors, they're looking to make sure that product is properly identified and it is certified to be used. If we do ever find, and it's very rare, where we find materials to be substandard, that gets tagged and non-conformance is done and the supplier is notified. And then the supplier will have to retake the product back and provide us with something that is certified. So even at the material inspection stage, everybody here in the factory has a role to make sure that our quality assurance program is being followed, and that is part of our quality assurance manual and our processes. So onto the testing. So there's a few tests that we do, again, to make sure that the product's going to perform and they're following our quality assurance program. So the first one is in the rough-in plumbing area, and this is optional for factories to do. Every factory that I've ever worked in or been part of has done this. What we do is once we have done the rough-in potable water lines, we'll put an air test to it. This test is typically 100 psi for 15 minutes. If the pressure is maintained, then we know that there is no leaks. If there is a pressure drop, then you have to find where the leak is coming from, do the repair and retest, and document the results. So for a modular factory, it's really important to catch this at the spot that it's most easy to identify and to repair. We do another test, and we'll talk about it later, at the final, when everything is built and constructed to make sure that there is no other leaks. But for us, when we want to find the mistake, we want to find it at the point source and not have to wait till the very, very end of the line. So this is something, like I said, many factories do because it makes a ton of sense. We also have to do a drainage, waste, and vent test. So a lot of times what we'll do is we'll have pre-assembled venting and we will go ahead and put 5 psi of air. It's ABS, so you can only use 5 psi, and make sure that it can hold for 15 minutes. If we do see air loss, then we know that there's a leak in a joint. Alternatively, you can wait and cap all the lines, fill the entire system with water, and hold it for 15 minutes. And again, make sure there is no water loss. If there is, you have to find the leak and repair. These results also get documented in the travel log and part of the unit documentation. Moisture. So being in a factory that is covered, we are fortunate that we can manage our products. So having said that, we still will do moisture tests on our lumber. We will do random checks to make sure that there is no wet wood. Every building that's constructed with wood, that's always a fear, is that if you trap wet wood in a building, it can cause mold. So moisture tests are done regularly in the roof truss area, in the wall framing area, and the floor truss area. For electrical tests, once the unit is fully complete, we will do an insulation resistance test. What we do is we, for 1 second, pulse 1080 volts to each part of the electrical distribution. Why we're doing that is we want to make sure that when we were constructing the unit, that there is no damage to any of the wiring. So if a pin nailer is being used to put trim together, it hasn't penetrated any wiring. If no fault shows up, that means that it's clean. If there is a fault that shows up and the test is done, then they must identify where it has happened, repair it, and retest the unit. These results are also documented in that travel log. Another electrical test that we do when the unit is done is we do an operational test. And this is really going through and turning on all the lights, making sure the switches work, checking appliances that they turn on and they turn off, making sure the receptacles are working by using a receptacle tester. When we have done the operational test to the entire unit, then we document those results and also include them in the travel log. And then we also perform a final plumbing test. Again, the unit must be fully complete for us to perform this test. What we do is, there's two ways to do it. One is we put 100 PSI of air to the entire system, and we have to hold the pressure for 2 hours. Then we come back and see if the pressure held. If they have a leak, there'll be a loss of pressure, and they have to identify where that leak is coming from, repair, and do it again. At Triple M Housing, we do both. We do an air test and we also do a water test. So for our water test, we will put water in the bathtub as well as the kitchen sink, plug the system, and make sure that water will hold. If we notice any leaks, then it must be repaired and the water test will be done again. Once we drain it, we will put RV antifreeze into the P-traps to make sure that pipes don't freeze during transportation before setup is done. These results are also documented. So after we have done all of this process and the documentation, now we are finally ready to label the unit. So our inspection team, they will do a final walk of the home when it is done. And they're doing a few things during this time. One is they're going and doing a punch list to make sure that the quality is acceptable and it meets our Triple M standard. So these also include cosmetic things. So making sure that the kitchen cabinets don't have any chips, making sure the sinks are put in square. They also are going through the documentation file in that travel log and making sure it is complete, and that if there was any repairs that needed to be done, that they were corrected and retested. So they will check the entire checklist. They will check all the testing paperwork. If the unit is acceptable at that point, then we are able to go and put that label on. So on the electrical panel, we will put the, our inspection agency is QAI, who provides us the labels. So we'll put that label on. We'll also complete the specification plate that will give all of the specifications of that particular unit and have that put inside the panel. When you see both of these things and the unit arrives at site, that's also a signal to you to let you know that, one, the product came from a factory that was third-party certified, and that they were certified to A277. On the specification, it will tell you what the home and unit was built to which standards, so that you can also check that it conforms to your area. Any work that is done on site, that does need to get inspected. So any of the services, connections, that would be something that would be inspected when the unit is finished at site. So I think that summarizes and hopefully gives some information and background of what testing is done, the checklists that are used, how we get third-party certified, and the boots on the ground in the factory of how that actually works in reality. And I think that's to you, Kathleen.
Okay, so in summary, before we open it up, just before we open up to questions and answers, I just wanted to reinforce a few key takeaways. Just every building must meet local code requirements. A277 certification may be relied on to confirm compliance with local requirements. And reinspection is not required for the work done in the factory. But as Sim said, we still do need those inspections and permits as usual for anything done on site. Factory certification can save time for both builders and building officials. And in addition to helping us deliver more, much needed these days, high quality housing in less time, factory built can help us deliver more housing with less neighborhood disruption. So we also dedicated a previous webinar to the environmental benefits of modular construction when it comes to GHG reductions, waste reduction, and resilience. So I'm hoping you'll check out those other webinars in our series as well. So with that, please enter your questions in the chat and we'll all do our best to answer them.
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen and Sim. That was really good. And I'm really happy we kept to our timing because that means we have almost 15 minutes for questions. So I see 24 questions now. I'm going to start off with one real Cody questions, but I think if Sim and Kathleen have looked, there's a bunch of really good questions on energy and on other things and also on the standards and what it contains. So there was one question from an anonymous attendee about spatial separation and items in 9, 10, 15 of the, in this case, BC building code. And the question is, would this fall to the manufacturer to ensure prior to delivery? Are these items covered in the standard? So first of all, they're not covered in the standard. And items that would relate to the design and construction of the building, like, for example, if there's non-combustible cladding pieces or size of openings that are constructed in the factory, as Sim explained, would make sure that the local requirements are complied with. If there are things that had to be confirmed, for example, on site, whether the limiting distance and spatial separation is really kept, I mean, that should have been also checked on the design and the permit in terms of where the foundation sits. But if that is an issue that needs to be measured on site, then that may be one thing that needs to be confirmed at the end. I think that's my understanding, and maybe Sim, if I got this wrong, you can maybe add to it, or Kathleen. Nope, Sim is nodding. You're on mute though. Okay. Good. So then, Kathleen, do you have another question, or did you find one that you would like to answer?
Sure, we have a question from Jitender, who is asking if it's a correct understanding of the NBC's requirement that A277 covers buildings, but not modules and panels. So it's actually, that I think it's a very good question, Jitender. It's something I'm going to look into to see if we need a wording change there. But what I would say to you is think of it as you would of like a truss, for example. So a module and panel is certified to meet the requirements that would be required as a component of the building. So the certification procedure applies and can be verified by the local official. Whether or not we've got the wording right in the code, well, I'm going to look into that. But absolutely, the certification covers the wording in the code applies to the whole building.
Thanks, Kathleen. Sim, did you find a question you'd like to answer, or? Yeah, okay, then go ahead.
Yeah, there's a question of where is the serial number shown on the QAI label. So on that specification plate that's on the electrical panel, along with that circular QI label, those both of those things have to be on there. And on the specification plate, they will ask for the manufacturer, it'll ask for the project name or model number, it'll ask for data manufacturer, and then it asks for modular serial number. So right at the very top of that nameplate, that's where you're going to see where that serial number is. So if you are ever requesting information from a factory, that's a number you want to provide because that's like I said, that's where all the documentation is going to be tied together. So good question. It's the nameplate and the specification plate. You would find that.
Thank you. So I did find a quick one, maybe for you, Sim, to just, if you can answer that. What transportation loads are considered in the design? Can you quickly speak to that? Because you mentioned it earlier, making things ready for transportation.
Yeah, so a lot of transportation depends where the region is going and the transportation company's equipment and what they are able to haul. And it varies. It varies by the highways, the routes. So for example, out of the Lethbridge area, we can send out a single unit, 30 feet wide, 76 feet long. And the weight of the home is not an issue because it has the right equipment. It's a home moving trailer. So it really depends on the transportation company. And all of this is identified at the start of your project to make sure that what you're building is actually transportable. The other thing that's also a big factor is height, because there is height limitations of what you can build and send under bridges when you're sending product to BC. Whereas if you're sending it to Saskatchewan, you don't have those limitations as much. So you can ask for overheight permits, but you do have to work with that province and the restrictions on the highways to understand.
And then there's wind loads, if I can add that. I mean, the wind loads during transportation, driving forces of the wind are considered, and therefore many of the buildings leaving the factory have actually more inherent resistance to wind than would necessarily be required in the location where they're installed. And many of them come with straps installed and so on.
Yeah, actually, Frank, that's a good point. So a lot of modular construction, when you look at the structural, it may look overbuilt, but the reason a lot of that is done is that we do have to make sure that when it transports, nothing structurally will change on it. And then from a wind resistance point as well, I'm not sure if people noticed in that drone footage or not, but you'll see strapping from the floor to the wall. And then you'll see engineered strapping from truss to the wall. You'll see belt rails in the wall system too. So that's another reason when we do get third-party certified and we're submitting our prints, those considerations are looked at when we submit our packages, because we do have to make sure that when it's transported, nothing happens.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why I mentioned it, because in our environment benefit webinar, the second one we did, we talk about the resilience advantage that some modular construction have in this case against high or extreme winds, actually. And so that's an important point to consider for where modular has a real advantage. That's why I wanted us to focus on it. Kathleen, do you have another question? Otherwise, well, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I see a couple of questions here about relocating modular buildings, and also what happens when if the buildings are resold and modified. So Brandon, yes, you're right. Relocating a modular building might not be possible based on the design criteria set out in the spec sheet. So the spec sheet will show you the specific loads and requirements that the home will meet or the building will meet. You have to remember that it always depends on what is the requirement locally. So if you move that home from one location to another, it's the new location's requirements that need to be met. The spec sheet would still give an indication to the local official how that home was built, but to answer Tony's question, if the certifications apply once they're resold and substantially modified, the certification only applies to the work that's done in the factory. So if there's renovations done afterwards, after it's installed on site, the certification doesn't apply to that work. So, and if a home is really modified and then moved to another location, then the building official would not be able to rely on what was delivered from the information from the factory.
Thanks, Kathleen. So I would like, and unless Sim has something, we have plenty of time. There's a couple of questions on energy efficiency and also air tightness. And I know that some of our members, we have actually gave a webinar, part of the environment webinar on net zero construction of modular. Some builders build to tier 4, for example, for the national code. The questions, and there's a number of them, ask for the BC step code, or for example compliance with the 936.5 I guess performance compliance in this case, and I would assume that that's part of the normal code compliance that the professionals in the factory would make the building meet. And then there's another question, if some factories employ energy advisors to, for example, do performance modeling, or if it's all prescriptive. And I think there was one other question on air tightness. Do you have, what are the air tightness measurements that you do? Can you speak to some of that, Sim, or?
Yeah, certainly. There is some homes that we're sending to BC right now that need to comply with step code. So right now what happens is we do document what we're doing for continuous vapor barrier building envelope. And we'll actually, at the end of the line for those units, we'll do a blower door test. So we do bring in a third-party contractor who comes in, performs a blower door test. Once it gets transported into site and the house is actually set up, powered, commissioned, they will perform another blower door test at that time. It seems a little bit redundant, and I think there is conversations going back and forth whether that's necessary or not. Now, the reason the factory ourselves will schedule that blower door test here is it's not really helpful to us to find out at site if there is an issue. We want to make it conform and perform before it leaves our factory. So that's why we'll engage somebody here. They'll do the test, and often we're seeing very, very good air exchanges, 1.5, 1.75. But I think the reason is in the factory, we do get a bit of an advantage because we're in a controlled environment. If there's any penetrations on that vapor barrier, we can properly caulk it and seal it. When we build our walls, our exterior walls of the home, we are building them on jigs, and we can run continuous vapor barrier, and we'll leave tails. And when we set those walls together, we'll go ahead and sandwich those tails. So we are very confident that our vapor barrier is going to perform. Any penetrations for electrical plugs or whatnot, we're using the right product to make sure that vapor seal is going to perform, and we're also caulking around it as well. Having done quite a few blower door tests, we've had to get very, very experienced at it. So it is a requirement in some of the homes we send out today in BC in some regions, and it's just part of what we do in our checklist and what we'll audit.
Yes, and what you referred to, CHBA is working, has submitted a code change request, and I think public review comments that factory test should be recognized. And we're actually also hoping that NRC will help us validate those differences that you just explained. Is there a difference or not? And to what extent can factory testing be recognized in the code? So that'll be maybe coming up in the future code. Not part of today's webinar, but again, another pitch for our webinars. The process webinar, the last one we gave in December, Sim is explaining and showing pictures of how the walls and floors are actually built. You can see the poly being applied, and why that is potentially another advantage of modular construction in reducing penetrations and potential faults of air barrier systems. Kathleen, do you have another one that you found? I was so intently listening to Sim, I failed to look at other exciting questions.
I'm afraid, Frank, I think we're out of time on the questions for now, but we will endeavor to answer those questions by email later.
Thanks for watching the time. That's awesome. So thank you all. This was our overview of code compliance for modular construction. Thank you for listening and attending. We hope you'll be interested in learning more about the opportunities and benefits that modular construction holds in Canada. And all that's left for me is to remind you that we will post the slide deck and the recording, hopefully by tomorrow, on the chba.ca/modular webpage. That's the one displayed right now. It's public. All the webinars and recordings are public. And we also encourage you, and I think that was also a question, to visit our member factory websites that are linked through that page, and you can go directly to the factory. If you find a factory anywhere in your region, you can just simply ask for the certification, or if you see a prefabricated or modular building on and has a label, you should find where that label comes from. And so as you may have seen on the intro slide, the next webinar, Financing for Factory Build, is coming up in March. So keep watching for this channel and for any updates. And thank you for joining us, and have a great day. Thank you so much.
Have a good day, everyone. Thank you.